This is an interview with Stephanie Rosselli for the Youngstown Historical Center of Industry and Labor Oral History Project titled Women at Work. The interview is being conducted at the Youngstown Historical Center of Industry and Labor, known as the Steel Museum, on February 21st, 2023. My name is Nicole Marino. Hi, Stephanie.
Hello.
Where did you and your family live when you were growing up?
I lived in Youngstown, Ohio, on the east side, and then when I was 10, we moved to the north side.
Very good. And what did your parents do for a living?
My father taught at the university and coached for many, many years, and my mother taught.
Very good. Where'd you go to high school?
Well, that's kind of interesting. My whole education was on one street. I went to a school that's now torn down. St. Joseph's Elementary is now part of the university, well, the Enclave. I'm not sure it's university owned, but, and then I went to Ursuline High School, and then I came down to Youngstown.
Very good. When did you graduate?
With a BS in education, 1970.
And when did you graduate high school?
66.
Very good. What'd you do right after high school?
Day after graduation, I started at Youngstown State University.
Very good. What was your very first job?
My first job, I was a ward clerk at, this is previous to, before I graduated, I was a ward clerk at Northside Hospital.
What did you do there?
Well, ward clerk was kind of an interesting job, actually. I certainly had lesser important roles like asking people, did they want more coffee and things like that. But I also was assigned, it was kind of interesting, to write the medical information, including medication, on little cards. And then those cards went to the nurse to approve. And then we sent a mnemonic device that ordered the medications and brought them back. And then I received them and gave them to the nurse. So that was probably the heavier part of my work.
Great. So how did you get your job? Either that one or...
Well, that's an interesting question. I was kind of thinking on that. And I would say a lot of it was word of mouth. I wrote down how many people called me about jobs that had come up. For instance, I had just moved back from Germany, and someone called and said they needed a children's librarian at Girard Public Library. So I applied for that position. Someone called me about a position as a public relations director in a community hospital in Massachusetts, and I went for the interview and got that job. So it was a strange, I probably have 10 of these that were phone calls, or this was before email, much of this, but were contacts, people who knew me from an experience. I got the teaching job for the Department of Defense Dependent Schools because I started a story time, and one of the teachers brought her children to the story time and said, oh, there's a position opening. So there was a lot of that kind of networking. I think there was one position for which I saw an advertisement in the newspaper, and it was a United Way position, and I applied to that. You know, you're always looking for jobs that will help to offer you more security, salary, benefits, insurance, you know, things of that nature, retirement. So while I followed my former husband around, I was always considering that.
Sure. So to bridge your work history from when you were young and right out of school and during high school to some of the things that you just mentioned, could you talk a little more about the difference between those two scenarios? I understand what you were just saying, but like when you just came out of school,
okay.
Did you?
Well, I had an opportunity, this was an interesting one, when I was applying for positions at Youngstown State University, leaving on graduation. One of my advisors said, don't just go to the county to apply, go to the district where you want to teach. And that made the difference for me. I got a job immediately, right out of college, and so I was definitely in education. I was in the field of graduation, which was very nice. And what it offered me is, that degree offered me so many things, is the opportunity to move within that. I was interested in arts. I was able to take an art position. From there, here's another example of word of mouth, is that the principal in that building, had someone come, a reading consultant. Did you do that? Had a reading consultant position. He was speaking to someone from a salesperson, came up to me and said, "Are you interested in a reading position? You'd have a 6-state region in the east of the United States." And I said, "Well, I'll give it a try." Okay, so there was an awful lot of opportunity that came up through my education degree. Rand McNally, I always found that these positions, you ask an interesting question, because I found in these positions, I seemed to never have the certificate, the license, the training, or the degree. So I was always chasing after that after I got the position. So while education requires continuous education, mine was in fields like I was going to Harvard to Project Zero. I was going to the Smithsonian Institute. I was going to the National Art Gallery. Based on grants, I will add, some of that was grants, but you're always looking to make an improvement. And I really wanted to be good at the field I was in. So kind of tried to say bloom where you're planted, but I was very interested in the fields I was in, so I wanted to do better at them. So I sought more information.
Right, so that was all very self-directed. That sounds admirable.
I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I guess it was. Yeah, it was.
It
definitely.
Sounds as if you had a drive. Did any of the positions that you had, even from the first time that you were working, provide you with training that you needed that was less self-directed? Well, some of the grants that I wrote allowed me to get further education. Sometimes, particularly my work in Stark County, they gave me a lot of professional latitude because my position was gifted and talented coordinator. But meanwhile, I wanted to pursue, arts teachers needed support. So I looked at integration of arts, and I was given professional latitude on that. Also, there was a lot of arts involved with gifted and talented education. So any opportunity I could have that they provided or that I wrote a grant for to get, it was a dual, I guess. I'd say it was very collegial in that respect. Sure.
We were working together to, I had to get supervision actually. After I got hired, they said you'll need to get a supervisory degree. So then I went to Ashland College and I got an advanced degree as an assistant superintendent and a principal so that I could supervise in my new role. So it was that kind of thing.
Great. What specific work did you do at your job?
I'm going to go to the role I played for about 15 years in Stark County. I did a similar role here in Mahoning County when I worked for what was then the Board of Education. And they had 11 locals, and I would work with each district on requirements of the state for gifted identification and programming and service to parents. When I went to Stark County, I oversaw, and wrong word I suppose, I worked with other coordinators in 17 locals. So I kind of coordinated a consortium of coordinators. I would have monthly meetings. I would do a strategic plan with them. We'd decide on programs we wanted to offer. So I did that. At the same time, I worked specifically in 3, sometimes 4 districts that needed very specific testing, assessment, programming. I'm trying to think of what other kinds of roles I played. County liaison between the county and the district. Much of it based on state requirements of the Department of Education, Ohio Department of Education.
Very good. That's your typical day. What types of, when you talk about the job and the conditions, and I recognize that there are several, but describe a typical day and the types of challenges that you might normally face.
Okay. I'm going to preface all that with saying I was looking, in my early years of marriage, moving around and basically following my former husband, I was looking at jobs more than career. So let's go to the point of career when we speak. And when you come to a typical kind of day, it involved, at that time, this was early on, first emails, so we had email. I would address emails. I always like to do that earliest in the morning because it helped me to project my day or, kind of rearrange things if I needed to. And then phone calls, so that would be first things. Then I had monthly consortium meetings, which were, I'm going to say, not consuming, but I had set up teams in the strategic plan. So I was working with a programming team, one with teacher professional development. So that was kind of consuming not just the monthly meeting, but the pieces and parts that went with each one of those committees and how I could be a support to them. In the end, I was about passing the baton appropriately so that anybody who came after me would have enough documentation and information to be able to do it. But the typical issues we're involved with, I had to meet with administrators in local districts and at the county level. I had to deal with budgeting, which I would describe, my knowledge of budgeting was very limited. And that would be a downfall to any position I had, that I didn't understand. I'm going to describe the nuances of budgeting or the basic issues involved. And additionally to that, I wasn't assertive enough to make more inquiries about how I could redirect funds or get funds for programming that I needed. All my positions were great. I never had in the red kind of thing, but it was a consuming part of the typical day. How could I make this work? Where could I, get some resources for this? And in general, I had in this position a lot of professional latitude. They trusted me to do the work. I wasn't micromanaged, and it was really a pleasing opportunity. But you mentioned challenges, so I will share with you a couple. There were incidents. I wouldn't say it was a continuous row to them because really I wasn't in any position except the 15-year position, or 20 years probably, because when I retired they asked me to come back and assist in a district, which I did do. But the challenges are fascinating when I look at them. I taught art in a garage, and if it wasn't for a wonderful man, the custodian named Emil Basista, who when he would see I taught in several schools at that time, he would have a parking space for me when I went there because you practically ate your lunch in the car. I went down, it was a tri-level school, so I was so happy to have a room, but I used to have to march students through a boiler room into a garage. There was no sink. So I used to be the Dutch girl, carrying water around in pails. So that, I look at that as that was probably a just environmental challenge, of which there were others. When I worked in one of the districts, the county level, there were 8 people in the carrel. We each had carrels. At that point, there was this printing, computers, telephones, conversations, meetings. It was, when I look at that, it was a very distracting environment to do good work. So I would probably project more. I mentioned the assertiveness. I would probably go and say, we need to redefine this space. How can I help do that? I would have wanted to be part of the problem solver in that environment. So that was one of the challenges. The other one, which was very peculiar, was a friend, colleague, also a teacher, asked me to go with her to a 9 o'clock at night, we didn't get home till 9. It was a 7 o'clock evaluation. The principal wanted to do the evaluation at night. And she asked me to go with her, which I did. We didn't get home till 9, but interesting. And I was kind of her sidekick in this interview, which was interesting. I was hired, another instance of oddity was, I was hired by the Department of Defense Dependent Schools on site. If I had been hired from the government here in the United States, I would have had many more resources available to me. They would have paid for storage for my goods. I would have had been in a ranking. I would have had senior, to kind of be in the mix. But just because I was kind of a walk-on, I didn't have those benefits. So when my husband left his job, I did not have a job at that point following, and I left that job. But we might have considered staying had I had the benefits that were afforded teachers who were hired on site. Now, they might have had a more rigorous hiring than the process I went through, and yet it was what it was. Another oddity, which you can, I'm trying to think, look at as, when you take a position, often when I was young, I wasn't looking at all the packages of it, the benefit packages, the sick leave, all of those things. As I went more into my career, I got a little more knowledgeable about that and asked a few more questions beforehand. But one of the things when I retired, which I think is interesting, they have a windfall provision. I was an educator and administrator. I worked 210 days or something. I worked more days than a teacher, but they could only count it for the one year is 180 days. So here I was working 210 for 15 years. In the end, I was multiplying the days and saying, I could have had a whole nother year that I worked. But this windfall provision went with, I think it was an arrangement based on STRS and social, it was early on a decision made, and a very good decision in many respects, but I always thought, oh, this would be the thing I'd march on Washington for, that I worked those days and that I should have, even if they gave me the time over the money, that would have been interesting. Also, people assumed that because you were in supervision, you were paid more. That wasn't necessarily true. Some teachers in local districts who had seniority in the district and didn't have any more education than me, but might have been paid more. So there's some interesting dynamics. You need to ask more questions, which I did not do. As I said at the very beginning here, I was a bit naive about, I was so happy to have jobs when I was following my former husband around. And then when you mentioned other challenges, there were some categories of, as a mother and a wife and employee that affected me. But then you're involved as a divorced mother. You're worrying about housing. You're worrying about definitely economics. When I took the job in Stark County, I made the decision not to move my children and not to move. My son was a senior. My daughter was in 8th grade, with everything laid out for her by her brother. She could go in the band, she could be on the tennis team, so she had all that information available to her, and he was a senior. I thought my moving them would have been detrimental to their health. Sure. So I drove to Canton for almost close to 20 years, and I listened to more books than I read in that time period, which is fascinating. And sometimes I went directly to my office, which is an interesting thing. They would provide, which is very nice, some benefit for your trips, but they counted your trip only when you went to the office and then went to a district. So my hour-and-a-half trek from Poland, Ohio, where I lived, to sometimes Massillon or out to Jackson could have been an hour and a half, which was, it didn't count if I went directly. You didn't put it on your expenses, so that was kind of funny. But it was a challenging thing my last years because gas, people complain now about gasoline, but it was up to $4 a gallon, close to when I was in the process of retiring. So there was an economic issue in that too, but it was really important. I regret one of the challenges as a mother. I didn't get to every single one of their activities, so that was disappointing, so it was, part of the mix there. But I also wanted to provide them with a quality education. So my current husband, this is another issue that emerged. My current husband said, see where they want to go, because I had heard you put a glass on an area around Poland, Ohio, and that's where they go to school for undergraduate. But I said the world is wherever you want to go. So my daughter Ann said I must go east, so she chose to go to Middlebury College in Vermont. And then my son Joseph chose to go to a small Quaker school in Philadelphia, outside of Philadelphia, called Haverford. What that meant, and if I could advise parents in this was a challenge to me, I decided that since both my parents were alive, as long as I could bring my children home during any of the holidays, I would try to do that. So transportation, getting my children to and from school, paying for school, all of that was an issue. And I bring up the pay for school because here's an issue. At that time they have, and believe me, I can't remember if it was a Pell Grant or what it was, but they counted, when I applied for these loans for Ann and Joseph, they counted the person who was living with you, the partner, the resident person, as compared with the father of the children. So the income of that person went in to deciding how much benefit you would get. That was an interesting challenge. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I'd say, let me think, personally, professionally, I think I've included quite a bit there.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So how about the working relationship that you had at your workplace with men or women or whomever that you were working with? How were those?
Oh, I think that's an interesting question. It was the most enriching professional, all of my jobs provided enriching professional experiences beyond measure. And I will share with you that on last weekend, I was with friends in Canton, my colleagues from Canton. We went to the ballet. At Christmas time, I met my former boss down in Charlotte, North Carolina. Tomorrow, I am going to lunch with a colleague of 50 years. Thursday, I'm meeting what we describe as the play group, people who had children on Thursday. It's been very rich professionally, and also enduring friendships evolved personally.
Very good. How did management or administration treat workers at your workplace? Or did you...
Okay. I shared a couple incidents, but as I wasn't employed any of these places long enough, I always felt, one, comfortable, two, that we were looking out for the best work we could do in the position, which could have required me doing more. I definitely did not have enough technology support. I will be clear on that. First of all, it was evolving. It's ever evolving. Every year, in one of the positions, I had to relearn the spreadsheet systems that the state wanted. And by the fourth year, I was exhausted, and I wasn't quick. And I think had I been more literate, a native to technology, I might have had more speed with it. But as it was, it required a lot of time that wasn't the content of the work. It was the implementation of it. So that what I would say was an ongoing challenge.
Did you have any struggles with coworkers or management or foremen or anything like that?
As I said, I was not assertive. I think if I had gone forward in a couple instances where I didn't realize the paper when I taught art was kept in each individual building. I thought you could move paper from here for these students to go here. Well, I was called in on the carpet on that. I'm going, oh my God, I had no idea that you couldn't move paper. So again, naivety played a role. Had more time in any one of these jobs, I believe would have given me more astuteness about how to operate, even within the framework of the position itself, and then in the larger system where I worked.
Did you ever go through any strikes while you were on the job?
Yes, I believe. I was one of the first women, let me backtrack. I was one of the first women to wear pants in teaching. And so after that, a memo went out that you could wear pantsuits and men could wear leisure suits. But that year, I believe there was also something they called a professional day, which I believe was more in keeping with a disagreement about contractual relationship. So there was that, and I don't remember that I went into work. I did, as an administrator, have to cover a school strike, and I was serving as an administrative person in an elementary school to assist my colleagues from the county office. That was a very difficult arrangement. It was resolved fairly quickly, but it was very challenging.
Okay. How long were you off work?
Related to
the strike.
That one professional day, they called it.
Just that one?
That was it. When I worked in the district, it was probably 4 or 5 days when I had to assist so that the local district could keep the school open.
Okay. Did it affect your living expenses at all?
No.
Okay. And did you ever have to report any grievances for yourself or for someone else at your workplace?
No. I'm trying to think of, we probably should have done something about the principal asking for the evaluation at 7 o'clock at night, but the environment of the school, I was so happy to have an art room. I should have probably said something about this is an unsafe environment for children to walk through this boiler room to get to the garage, but I did not. And then, no, I don't have any, when I worked at the hospital, no. Public relations director, no, nothing's coming to mind.
So what was the atmosphere for women in the workforce in your experiences?
Well, as I said, I was moving along, so I wasn't establishing a lot, but and everywhere I went, I was welcomed and made to feel comfortable. However, I do know that there were issues. I had friends tell me, a person who taught at a university said the men were paid more, and she did the same hours. She worked in the summer, and she had office hours. So there was that going on, but I wasn't aware of it in my positions. I also did not investigate it. So I was a little, again, not tuned into every aspect of benefit packages.
Sure.
And contractual arrangements.
And that makes...
That's how it was for me.
Well, and each person's experience is different, so you can only speak to what you recall yourself. So, would you say that were there many women employed at the positions that you held, or
in general education? In my circles, there were a lot of women, particularly when I started at elementary, but men were starting to enter the field. And remember, I was elementary age. Then I had to get additional certificates, and that led to more men involved. And in my last job at the county, I would say there were still more women, but men. Also, I definitely would say that there was one female of 11 superintendents, I believe, in Mahoney County when I was here. And in Stark County, I believe it was 3. But eventually, by the time I left, there were 7 or 8. So definitely that's evolved.
Okay. And did you ever feel like a minority yourself in any of your positions?
Only because of lack of knowledge, I would say I was a minority, but no, not as a female. No.
Okay.
But I have to, you bring up a really good point. Except the last job, most of my superiors were men.
Okay. Was there proper facility for you to have privacy, such as restroom, locker room?
Well, that's funny. We never had phones in our classroom. When I think of the conditions, it was challenging, but again, they've made significant improvements. Some of them have been thrust upon them by safety issues of students now that there was no regard at that time. I was moved into the gym once because I had no heat in my classroom. We're sitting with our coats on. But
you mentioned that you were married. How did your employment affect your relationship with your husband?
Well, there were 2 husbands. The first husband, I felt I needed to work. I felt that, I don't know how that came upon me, but I felt I needed to have a job to contribute to the family. So once you do that, you definitely have new challenges related to needing cars and transportation and dinner and meals and activities for the children. So there were those, I'm almost child care. I'm going to describe them as somewhat typical. I do remember that I had to, on divorcing, I had to buy a car. I wanted to keep the children in the house we were in, so I had to learn about loans, on my own and establish, and also maintaining a home is a whole different thing than buying a home. So there were, that relationship was a little bit stressed. Okay, in the second marriage, which I was divorced in 92, then we married in 2000. It was like a 10-year time period when I was not married. Interestingly, my husband current husband, worked in Pittsburgh, and at the same year I was working in Canton. So we got an apartment in Canton, and so I could stay there, and if needed, overnight, and then he would come to here, or we'd both stay in Canton, and it was a really very pleasing for all the transportation that was involved. So it was kind of had a whole romantic edge to it. There we were. It was our city home and our country home. The city of Canton and country was Poland. But then we gave up that apartment, and then he retired, and I subsequently retired. And now we're both there.
Great. You mentioned you have children, and you talked a little about how your work affected them. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Oh, I think you'd have to ask them. But my whole goal was that they would be able to participate in something that would be life related. So I wasn't really big on a lot of group sports. So tennis was one that I thought they could do the rest of their life. We didn't have a pool close available, so tennis was one, and music. So those were the two main. I always told them, you won't have a lot of inheritance, but you will have music lessons, and that's it. So that was important to me. So those would be. I wasn't again always able to get to all of the tennis matches, but and also they participated in the band, so that was a wonderful part. They enriched my life, so I'd be with that.
And how did you manage? You mentioned childcare earlier. How did you manage that in each of those stages that you mentioned?
First of all, it was early on.
Working, yeah.
Yeah, it was early on. So there were neighbors in Germany. My daughter, there was a period between when my former husband would go to work in the afternoon and I taught in the morning. It was a half-day position. And we lived on the economy. There was not military or housing for civilians. We were on a military base. So it was a place where they trained NATO troops. So we lived on the economy in a housing with a German family, and they were the sitters at one point. When we moved back to the States, there were some challenges with neighbors, but then I found someone through the church who could help with Anne in the morning, and then my neighbor next door. So it was, a lot of kind of jostling, but they were always wonderful people, still in touch with them, and that kind of worked out. But it was, at the time, I'm thinking, how are we going to deal with this? Because you also want them to participate in music lessons and things like that. So.
Sure. Did you have to take care of your parents at the same time you were raising your children? Was that a scenario that you found yourself in?
Actually, my parents were both professionals and working, and it wasn't until I was close to retirement that my parents needed more care. And I had the joy of being one of, we were 4 siblings, and we all had kind of roles we could play in being able to keep them in their own home until it passed. So that was kind of a beautiful thing.
Very good. And you're retired now, you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a pension plan from any of your employers?
Yes, state teachers' retirement, which I'm very thankful for. But also, when I worked for the Department of Defense, I was able to buy that year. So there was a lot of reciprocity going on, which I'm very appreciative for. Also, before I started teaching, they asked me to teach or to substitute teach. So I substitute taught. And I guess at that time I had signed something off that I wouldn't be able to take retirement as a substitute something. But I was able to get years based on those experiences, and including the Social Security is a whole nother issue that is related to. I followed a husband around and worked at jobs that had Social Security, but you lose that based on a formula.
With the windfall,
yeah.
I understand.
So that was an interesting experience too.
Okay.
And but I'm trying to think of any other. No, I was able to move. There was reciprocity between a lot of these positions, so that things moved out so that I could get time.
So that you could get that.
Yeah.
That's good. That's excellent. And then there's a question here about being at a job place where the company closed while you were working. So was that a scenario you ever found yourself in?
No. No.
Okay. Well, I think that sums up everything. Is there any piece that you would like to add that you feel like?
Just I'm grateful for my education that it provided me so many opportunities in education and outside the field. And you also have to be ready to receive information, and that was part of the mix, that it provided it, and I was up for doing it. Even though many of my jobs required it, it was a really rich experience working. And I was interested in being a historical architect. So I ended up happily in education, circuitous route. I'm still involved with history. I was on the board of the Mahoney Valley Historical Society, so still involved.
Very good. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, you're
This
very
was,
welcome.
This is lovely to talk to you
Very
today.
nice.
Thank you so much.